Greetings, friends of liberty. One complaint, that I must register my own age, even though 'tis commonly called the age of reason, is that it is nonetheless an age filled with dogmas of all kinds. Number one, of both the Anglican and Catholic churches, with their odd notions that somehow, when Christ was nailed to the cross, that this forgave the sins of every murderer and rapist on the British Isles, and throughout the world from here to eternity. What a quaint notion. Number two, secondly, that the innumerable present political dogmas of Rousseau and our French political friends, who imagine that they need only guillotine their way to utopia. And number three, thirdly, the many dogmas of our so-called doctors of medicine, with their leeches and bleeding, and their belief that one can divine the character of a man or woman by the shape of their skull. Such inanities, truly. And yet, when I survey your own 21st century North America, I also find a quite astounding number of dogmas, none more bizarre than that of Robin J. DiAngelo. And today we shall examine 64 dogmatic affirmations of this well-known racist sociologist and CRT theorist, taken from her book White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. Ms. DiAngelo, previously a professor at Westfield State University in Massachusetts and now tenured at the University of Washington, is also a consultant and diversity trainer, leading seminars and discussions in institutions around the country propagating the dogmas of DEI to tens of thousands of individuals. Her book, read by many people in 2020 during the pandemic lockdowns and arguably influential in increasing the intensity of riots throughout the country, spent 155 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. To start, let's briefly first review the terms I use here. An ideology is a self-deceptive belief system, either secular or religious, and a dogma is an element or aspect of that belief system, usually one regarded as important. So the virgin birth would be a dogma of Christianity, as would the belief in the Trinity, the assumption of the Virgin Mary into heaven, or the real presence of Christ, in other words, his actual blood and flesh in the little wafer of the Eucharist. An affirmation, as I use the term, is a belief, such as those above, that one wishes were true, but for which either no evidence exists or evidence exists showing that the belief is false. A typical example of a religious affirmation would be the belief of many Muslims that Muhammad was the prophet channeling a supernatural being called Allah. Instead, the more quotidian reality is that Muhammad, as David Wood often says, was, among other vocations, an illiterate 7th century caravan robber. Let's start now with evaluating the statements that Ms. DiAngelo wishes were true, but that are either unproven or false. Affirmation number one. White people in North America live in a society that is deeply separate and unequal by race, and white people are the beneficiaries of that separation and inequality. No, the essential reality in modern America, that one shouldn't have to point out to Ms. DiAngelo since she's a sociologist, is that in America, as in many other countries, different ethnic groups, as sociologists have shown for centuries, form their own communities, since they often enjoy living together, which is perfectly normal, with members of their own ethnic groups. So, for example, in New York City, you typically had Italian neighborhoods, Hispanic neighborhoods, Orthodox Jewish neighborhoods, Polish neighborhoods, Chinatown, and many others. Separate by choice, not racism. And you also, of course, had separateness by socioeconomic status. So if you were rich, you moved to Park Avenue or got out of the city altogether by moving to Connecticut. Affirmation number two. The United States began with the attempted genocide of indigenous people. Now, while it's true that scholars and researchers generally debate how many Native Americans died as a result of their exposure to various deadly European diseases, for the most part, the resulting depopulation was not intended, which genocide is. So, for example, when the Spanish explorer de Soto wandered from 1539 to 1542, likely through parts of Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, Arkansas, and Louisiana, researchers now believe that he may have, as an indirect result, exposed many tens of thousands of Indians to deadly diseases, thus subsequently depopulating these areas. But as unfortunate as that result was, it obviously wasn't genocide. Affirmation number 3. The identities of those sitting at the tables of power in this country have remained remarkably similar: white, male, middle and upper class, able-bodied. So here her implication is that white people, through their alleged racism, and males, through their alleged sexism, have kept minorities and females from sitting at the tables of power. Is this true in 2023, after America put up with 8 disastrous years of President Obama? The sociological reality to which Ms. DiAngelo's a progressive is entirely oblivious, but which many economists such as Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell and writers such as Jason Riley have shown, is that while the black community is indeed underachieving in comparison with the white, this underachievement is the result of the enormous and disproportionate influence of governmental policies on that community. What are some of these disproportionate, harmful policies? Number 1, the violence and increased incarceration of the drug war. Number 2, the intrinsic patheticness of public education, both K-12 and collegiate. Number 3, minimum wage laws, which put large percentages of black youth out of work. Number 4, gun control, which prevents blacks from defending their communities from criminals and drug dealers. Number 5, affirmative action, which, as Thomas Sowell first pointed out in the 70s, through mismatching of students in colleges, damages black scholastic achievement and lowers graduation rates. And number 6, the welfare state, which breaks apart black families and causes many children to be born to and raised by single parents. Liberal progressives like Ms. DiAngelo are the reasons that most of these policies exist. And again, they all affect the black community disproportionately, which means, ironically, that Ms. DiAngelo and liberals like her are collectively responsible for an enormous amount of black suffering. Affirmation number 4. Ms. DiAngelo claims that whites are racist since they are socialized into a deeply internalized sense of superiority that we either are unaware of or can never admit to ourselves. So while it's true that many blacks and whites and Asian Americans understand that the black community, as I just said, is underachieving relative to other communities, first, contrary to what she says, numerous people are aware of this, and secondly, she has shown no proof that whites in general believe that this is due to their genetic superiority. Affirmation number 5. She then claims that this alleged unconscious racism and feeling of superiority means that whites perceive any attempt to connect us to the system of racism as an unsettling and unfair moral offense, and that we should conceptualize this process as white fragility. It is born of superiority and entitlement. White fragility is not weakness per se. In fact, it is a powerful means of white racial control and the protection of white advantage. So let's delineate what she just did. Number 1, she ignored the fact that the black community is actually underachieving because of the huge number of progressive policies which damage it. Number 2, she claimed with no proof that non-blacks, therefore, seeing this underachievement, conclude that they are genetically superior to blacks. And number 3, she then claimed that when whites object to being typecast as genetic racists, as she's done, they are exhibiting white fragility, implying that they show these feelings as a devious and manipulative power play. So how does a person like Miss DiAngelo become so self-deceived? Number one, because of her utter obliviousness to why the black community is underachieving. And number two, because of her ability to project obvious falsehoods onto others, simply assuming that she's right about them. Affirmation number 6. She says, I was taken aback by how angry and defensive so many white people became at the suggestion that they were connected to racism in any way. But over time, I began to see what lay beneath this anger and resistance to discuss race or listen to people of color. No, she didn't see or learn anything, but simply developed her own set of rationalizations to explain away their understandable anger at her racist treatment of them. Affirmation number 7. She says that most appeared to believe that racism ended in 1865 with the end of slavery. Completely false. Most people don't believe that. Most people are aware of Jim Crow laws and the racist resistance to the civil rights movement. Affirmation number 8. She says, while there is no biological race as we understand it, race as a social construct has profound significance and shapes every aspect of our lives. No. First, as biologists Neil Risch at the University of California and Martin Feldman at Stanford have shown, there are indeed good reasons to think that biological races exist. Secondly, even if races don't exist, ethnic groups have definite traits and characteristics, and these go a long way towards explaining ethnic differences. But she completely ignores the reality of ethnic groups in America, only using the word twice in the whole book. Affirmation number 9. She says, in fact, when we try to talk openly and honestly about race, white fragility quickly emerges, and we are so often met with silence, defensiveness, argumentation, certitude, and other forms of pushback. This is the level of her self-deception. She can't apparently understand why whites and Asians would respond to being typecast as racist by a racist such as herself with silence, defensiveness, argumentation, certitude, and other forms of pushback. Affirmation number 10. She says, we must be willing to consider that unless we have devoted intentional and ongoing study, our opinions are necessarily uninformed, even ignorant. No, we must be willing instead to consider that universities and colleges throughout the Western world are filled with ideologues who are paid by the American taxpayer or those of other countries to indoctrinate whites and Asians into thinking they're bad. Affirmation number 11. She says, interrupting the forces of racism is ongoing lifelong work because the forces conditioning us into racist frameworks are always at play. Our learning will never be finished. Exactly the opposite. It's the indoctrinating of innocent human beings which is ongoing lifelong work, because in the absence of force, humans are naturally rational and don't want to accept falsehoods, especially about themselves. Affirmation number 12. Briefly, individualism holds that we are each unique and stand apart from others, even those within our own social groups. Exactly, that's called diversity, Ms. DiAngelo. Is there something wrong with that? Affirmation number 13. Individualism is a storyline that creates, communicates, reproduces, and reinforces the concept that each of us is a unique individual and that our group memberships, such as race, class, or gender, are irrelevant to our opportunities. A number of falsehoods here. First, all of us as individuals have free will, so it's no storyline, but the reality. Secondly, individualism as a social theory doesn't deny that numerous other factors such as ideological or economic or political can influence us, but simply that because we have the ability to think, we're capable of overcoming any negative aspects of these influences over time. Affirmation number 14. Objectivity tells us that it is possible to be free of all bias. No, not at all. What objectivity tells us is that understanding the world is possible. which is why Darwin, Newton, Einstein, and Mendel were great scientists. So it's not surprising that, given how unscientific her approach to race is, that she would attempt to undercut science. Affirmation number 15. She says, on some level, we know that Bill Gates' son was born into a set of opportunities that will benefit him throughout his life, whether he is mediocre or exceptional. Yet even though Gates' son has clearly been handed unearned advantage, we cling tightly to the ideology of individualism when asked to consider our own unearned advantages. So there are numerous fallacies to unpack here. Number one, first, all children have privilege, in other words, unearned advantage. That's what it means to be a child. And for many children nowadays, that unearned privilege lasts at least until age 22. Number two, secondly, it's true that Bill Gates' son has more privilege than the average son or daughter, but so does Malia and Sasha Obama. They have unearned privilege and will have it throughout their life. And what's that supposed to prove about individualism? Thirdly, after giving us the example of Bill Gates' son, she then implies that white people are to him as black people are to the average person. And that us whites can't accept our unearned privilege because we're white. Is this true? No. Remember how I described all the reasons for the underperformance of the black community in America? Their disproportionate exposure to public education, gun control, the drug war, affirmative action, the welfare state, minimum wage laws, and many other horrendous governmental policies. So if the white community is not subject as much to these policies and as a result has more income and education and a longer lifespan, is that greater relative white achievement the fault of whites? Is their higher living standard and relatively peaceful communities and longer lifespan unearned? No, they earned every penny of their extra income and every minute of their long lifespans. But Miss DiAngelo can't accept this, so her only recourse is to turn around and point the finger at Whitey. Talk about unconscious bias. Secondly, one should point out how very privileged Miss DiAngelo is herself as a liberal racist having a position in academia. Higher education in America due both to the tax exemptions on property tax, capital gains tax, and others granted to private universities like Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, and also to the direct state support for public universities, is filled with many, many more privileged liberals and their privileged liberal ideologies than would otherwise ever be the case. In a strictly private educational system, where, as surveys now show, the public is still not very woke overall, no one would ever support Miss DiAngelo's racist ideology. In addition, without Title 7 and 9 of the Civil Rights Act, which scare corporations, government departments and their HR departments, and colleges and their woke administrators, no one would hire Miss DiAngelo and other racist indoctrinators to lecture and browbeat their employees so they can avoid being subject to a lawsuit. They only do it so that if they're sued by a disgruntled minority or woman, they will look better in front of the judge or the jury, since they've done everything conceivable not to have a racist or sexist workplace. That's why, before Title 7 and 9, no one ever hired racists like Miss DiAngelo on a regular basis to lecture white Americans. And so, if this understanding is true, we can see how very privileged Miss DiAngelo is to get tenure at an American university and her speaking fees to lead seminars and training sessions giving whites guilt trips for their skin color. That is unearned advantage, which is privilege granted indirectly by the state. But of her privilege, Miss DiAngelo is completely oblivious. Affirmation number 16. For many white people, the mere title of this book will cause resistance because I am breaking a cardinal rule of individualism. I am generalizing. Completely false. The problem is not that she's generalizing, but that she's doing it badly. She's generalizing based on irrelevancies. So if a scientist looked at whites and blacks and concluded that there must be some difference in skin pigmentation, to make them look different, and he applied that understanding to every single person, that would be a correct generalization. Black people have melanin, white people don't. But if instead the person, as famous Professor Leonard Jeffries of the City College of New York did, concluded that blacks are sun people and whites are ice people, and furthermore that us ice people are cruel and violent because we have less melanin in our bodies, then that would be a generalization too, but a very bad one. Question: which person is Miss DiAngelo more like? Affirmation number 17. She says, perhaps you grew up in poverty, or are an Ashkenazi Jew of European heritage, or were raised in a military family. Perhaps you grew up in Canada, Hawaii, or Germany, or had people of color in your family. None of these situations exempts you from the forces of racism. Again, just a pure affirmation on her part. It's just as possible that Jewish people, because they've experienced the Holocaust, are hardly ever racist against blacks. In other words, according to her, no Jew has learned the slightest thing from the Holocaust. They must be a real dumb people. On the other hand, if black people talk about racism against them, Miss DiAngelo is all ears and tells us all to be quiet and listen. Affirmation number 18. She says, referencing Ibram Kendi, Kendi goes on to argue that if we truly believe that all humans are equal, then disparity in condition can only be the result of systemic discrimination. First, Kendi is making the same mistake that she is in assuming that governmental policies affect all ethnic groups equally. They do not. Secondly, ethnic groups are diverse and unique, just as individuals are, in a million different ways. Which means, for example, that the fact that there are virtually no black pro surfers is not due to racism, but likely because blacks live more in the inner city and like to do other sports more. Affirmation number 19. Under the skin, there is no true biological race. Again, this is disputed among biologists, and even if it's false, we know that some ethnic groups, like Jews, have distinct genetic profiles, and that it's certainly not out of the realm of possibility that the reason that Jews crush every other ethnic group intellectually could be partly for genetic reasons. So, for example, even though there are only 16 million Jews in the world, out of almost 8 billion people, half of all world chess champions have been Jewish. Let me repeat that. About 0.25% of the world population is Jewish, but they made up 50% of world chess champions. Affirmation number 20. She says, regarding the American idea of the great melting pot, that this process of assimilation, speaking English, eating American foods, discarding customs that set them apart, reified the perception of American as white. No, certainly with food it didn't. In America, all immigrants brought their own foods and added them to the national cuisine. So now pizza is American, brats and beer and pork schnitzel are American, Chinese and Thai food are beloved throughout the country, Jewish corned beef and cabbage on rye, it's about the best sandwich you could ever dream of, Korean barbecue is becoming increasingly popular, and delicious sushi is found everywhere. So no, Miss DiAngelo, you don't have to eat burgers to be an American. Affirmation number 21. She says, because race is a product of social forces, it has also manifested itself along class lines. Poor and working class people were not always perceived as fully white. Nope, crackers were always fully white. They were looked down on because they were hillbillies. Again, she's distorting reality to make her theory look better. Affirmation number 22. She says, all humans have prejudice. We cannot avoid it. People who claim not to be prejudiced are demonstrating a profound lack of self-awareness. Again, there's no evidence for that racist affirmation, and even if it were true, it wouldn't indicate how much. But I wonder if she can accept that FBI stats have shown that blacks have twice the number of hate crime offenders as whites do per capita. Affirmation number 23. She says, most of us can acknowledge that we do feel some unease around certain groups of people, if only a heightened sense of self-consciousness. But this feeling doesn't come naturally. Our unease comes from living separate from a group of people while simultaneously absorbing incomplete or erroneous information about them. She then claims that this feeling of unease is prejudice in all cases. So this is wrong in at least two ways. First, lots of people are around ethnic groups without feeling uneasy. And secondly, if we do feel uneasy, there may obviously be many reasons besides prejudice. So a typical reason for a Chinese, Korean, or Jewish person is that blacks are 5 times more violent than whites and commit twice as many hate crimes. So Asians or Jews who have traditionally been discriminated against might justifiably feel relatively uneasy in the presence of blacks. Affirmation number 24. She says, I grew up in poverty and felt a deep sense of shame about being poor. But I also always knew that I was white and that it was better to be white. And why would this have been? Perhaps because the black community has been so damaged by the many governmental policies I outlined above? And would she really have felt it was better to be white than the great black concert pianist Andre Watts? Or the great economist Thomas Sowell? Or the great black opera singer Grace Bumry? Would she have? Affirmation number 25. She says, when a racial group's collective prejudice is backed by the power of legal authority and institutional control, it is transformed into racism, a far-reaching system that functions independently from the intentions or self-images of individual actors. She then wants to imply that this is the United States today. Firstly, there's no reason to think whites have collective prejudice against blacks. Secondly, if they did, there's no measurement of how much prejudice they have. And thirdly, even if a racial system like this exists in the U.S., which it doesn't, it's still always motivated by individuals. The system in and of itself never does anything because only individuals act. And this is a problem for her because there are relatively so few individual acts of anti-black prejudice in the America of 332 million people that she can point to today. So she blames the system in the same way that a Christian blames the non-existent devil. Affirmation number 26. She says, again trying to attack individualism and meritocracy, that people in the U.S. think that those who don't succeed are just not as naturally capable, deserving, or hardworking. No, Americans have the concept of the deserving poor, which is people who are poor through no fault of their own. And Americans traditionally have been enormously charitable to the deserving poor. Secondly, Americans understand that even though they live in a more or less free country, some people win the lottery, some people have rich parents, and some people choose careers that give them happiness without necessarily wanting or making them rich. So in the end, her attempt to smear Americans by claiming that in every case they think a poor person deserves his poverty or a rich person his wealth is false. Affirmation 27. She says, the direction of power between white people and people of color is historic, traditional, and normalized in ideology. False in every way. The direction of power before the 60s and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society welfare state disaster was that blacks were constantly coming closer to whites in their standard of living and in their societal and economic success. But since then, when both liberal policies like the welfare state and gun control and conservative policies like the drug war have damaged black families and communities, stagnation. A typical stat here from my review of Jason Riley's Please Stop Helping Us would be that from 1940 to 1960, the percentage of poor blacks fell by 40%, whereas from 1970 to 1990, it fell by 2%. So before the Great Society, a 40% reduction. Afterwards, 2%. So much for Miss DiAngelo's ideology. Affirmation number 28. She says, racism is deeply embedded in the fabric of our society. Again, just a pure affirmation, what she wishes were true. All hard indicators, like the number of lynchings, which have decreased from about 160 per year in 1890 to essentially zero in 1970, the number of race hoaxes, which have skyrocketed throughout American universities because there is so little actual racism to report. And number 3, the increase in black criminality and killing of whites, with blacks now killing twice as many whites as whites kill blacks, all show that white-on-black racism, despite her fervent wishes, is not a serious national problem. Affirmation number 29. The system of racism begins with ideology, which refers to the big ideas that are reinforced throughout society. Ideology is reinforced across society, for example, in schools and textbooks, political speeches, movies, advertising, holiday celebrations, and words and phrases. Again, she's making America in 2023 seem like Nazi Germany, with its anti-Semitism and idealization of the Nordic ideal. But can she point to a single racist anti-black ideology that even 5% of Americans believe in today? Where are the newspapers, the books, the television shows, and the films? Black athletes are celebrated throughout American society. Isn't that slightly different than the Nazis? Affirmation number 30. Continuing on her previous theme, she says, examples of ideology in the United States include individualism, the superiority of capitalism as an economic system, and democracy as a political system, consumerism as a desirable lifestyle, and meritocracy. Anyone can succeed if he or she works hard. No, these belief systems are truths, not ideologies. It's her conspiracy theory that racism is everywhere that's an ideology. So again, individualism is simply the acceptance of the fact that we all have free will, and capitalism is the truth that free societies, whose economic aspect is capitalistic, are the most moral, the most productive, and the most meritocratic that can exist. Affirmation number 31. She says individual whites may be against racism, but they still benefit from a system that privileges whites as a group. False. Again, the fact that blacks as a community are underachieving, mainly because of the policies of liberals like her, does not indicate that whites have received any unearned advantages. All it indicates is that blacks are damaged by her policies. Affirmation number 32. She says, stating that racism privileges whites does not mean that individual white people do not struggle or face barriers. It does mean we do not face the particular barriers of racism. They certainly could face racism in Harlem. Affirmation number 33. She says whiteness rests upon a foundational premise. The definition of whites is the norm of standard for human, and people of color is a deviation from that norm. Whiteness is not acknowledged by whites. So whiteness is not acknowledged by most whites because that's not our standard. Instead, there's a huge range of standards, politics being a typical example. Some whites are progressives, like she is. Some are independents or libertarians, and others are conservative. There's no political belief that corresponds to whiteness. Secondly, Indian Americans are often as black as blacks, but are extremely successful, having an average household income of over $100,000. Why would that be if whiteness were the standard? Affirmation number 34. She says, a person of color may refuse to wait on me if I enter a shop, but people of color cannot pass legislation that prohibits me and everyone like me from buying a home in a certain neighborhood. The white majority got rid of Jim Crow. But did they get credit from her for destroying it? Whites never get credit for her for anything. Affirmation number 35. She says, speaking of the baseball player Jackie Robinson, the first black player in the major leagues, while Robinson was certainly an amazing baseball player, this storyline depicts him as racially special, a black man who broke the color line himself. The subtext is that Robinson finally had what it took to play with whites, as if no black athlete before him was strong enough to compete at that level. Laughably false. First, virtually no one in America thinks that there weren't other blacks who could have also succeeded in breaking the color barrier. And secondly, his success was partly a function of the time being right for baseball integration to finally happen. Affirmation number 36. She says about Black History Month, I'm not against Black History Month, but it should be celebrated in a way that doesn't reinforce whiteness. Excuse me. As you can see, whites can never win with her. Probably the most apt quote about Black History Month comes from Dr. Thomas Sowell, who sarcastically said, what is called Black History Month might more accurately be called the Sins of White People Month. Affirmation number 37. Although rare individual people of color may be inside the circles of power, Colin Powell, Clarence Thomas, Marco Rubio, Barack Obama, they support the status quo and do not challenge racism in any way significant enough to be threatening. False with regard to Clarence Thomas, who constantly challenges the racist status quo that progressive like Miss DiAngelo champion. Secondly, Barack Obama, through his pathetic Attorney General Eric Holder, was a facilitator of racism and of tension between whites and blacks in, for example, not prosecuting the Black Panthers when they engaged in deliberate voter obstruction and in racializing the Department of Justice. Affirmation number 38. She says, white supremacy has shaped the system of global European domination. It brings into existence whites and non-whites, full persons and sub-persons. No, the existence of countries like Hong Kong demonstrates that the British were interested in spreading the values of freedom and capitalism to people of all colors. And the Chinese in Hong Kong made one of the greatest cities that has ever existed in Asia as a result. Are the people in Hong Kong white, Miss DiAngelo? Excuse me. Affirmation number 39. She says, in light of the reality of historical and continual white supremacy, white complaints about reverse racism by programs intended to ameliorate the most basic levels of discrimination are profoundly petty and delusional. Let's break this down. Yes, there was historical white supremacy based on slavery and Jim Crow laws, which are now all gone. Secondly, there is presently greater white achievement due to, as explained, the many progressive governmental policies damaging the black community. And three, the complaints from Asian Americans of reverse discrimination at Ivy League institutions are obviously not petty and delusional, but accurate. Affirmation number 40. Naming white supremacy changes the conversation in two key ways. It makes the system visible and shifts the locus of change onto white people where it belongs. No, pretending that white supremacy still exists spreads racism against whites instead of actually helping blacks and shifts the locus of change away from liberals and progressives where it should be. Fix that for you, Miss DiAngelo. Affirmation number 41. She says that if people aren't convinced that white supremacy still exists in America, they should think about Disney movies, music videos, sports heroes, Chinese food, Aunt Jemima's syrup, Uncle Ben's rice, the Taco Bell Chihuahua, Columbus Day, Apu from The Simpsons, and the donkey from Shrek. It doesn't get more ignorant than this. Let's take these one by one. Number one, today's Disney movies indicate the opposite of white supremacy, the woke racism and identity politics that she herself espouses. Number two, sports heroes? Well, there used to be OJ, But there's still Michael Jordan, Muhammad Ali, Tiger Woods, Joe Louis, Hank Aaron, Bill Russell, Magic, Kareem, Jim Brown, Bo Jackson, and Barry Sanders, all heroes. Number 3, Chinese food? She's really reaching here. Thai, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Indian food is beloved by Americans. Number 4, Aunt Jemima's syrup and Uncle Ben's rice. No, to the contrary, numerous Americans have stopped buying these brands since they canceled these familiar faces. Taco Bell's Chihuahua? Arribe, arribe. Oh, sorry, that's Speedy Gonzales. Number 6, Apu Nahasa Pimapetelon from The Simpsons. Apu was a brilliant character who embodied ethnic humor as many Simpsons characters do, and it was a tragic day in American comedy when The Simpsons succumbed to wokeness by demoting Apu to a background position. Number 7, The Donkey from Shrek, narrated by Eddie Murphy. Can you imagine how outraged the humorless woke are that black dialect would be used for a donkey? Affirmation number 42. Next, she tries to guilt-trip American white students by asking, if you went to school together, did you all sit together in the cafeteria? If not, why not? Were the honors or advanced placement classes and the lower track classes equally racially integrated? If not, why not? So kids of different ethnic groups sometimes don't sit together. It's no one's fault. Secondly, because of the damage inflicted on the black family historically by the welfare state, public education, affirmative action, the drug war, and other policies, black students don't do as well scholastically, so are not found as often in AP courses. Affirmation number 43. For example, if white and Asian heritage students were the primary racial groups in your school was likely to be seen as better than a school with more representation from black and Latinx students. What were you learning about the racial hierarchy and your place in it from geography? What I was learning is that many students learn, which is that Asian students work harder than everyone else, and this is statistically demonstrable in many different countries. Affirmation number 44. She says, after a white nationalist march and the murder of a counter-protester, the President of the United States said that there are very fine people on both sides. This comment would have been unthinkable from a high-ranking public official just a few years ago. She leaves out two important things here. First, President Trump explicitly condemned the racism, saying on that same day, August 12th, 2017, we condemn in the strongest possible terms this egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence on many sides. Secondly, lots of BLM protests resulted in billions of dollars of property damage over the course of the whole summer, with over a dozen people killed. Yet Ms. DiAngelo doesn't feel any need to comment on that violence, nor the Democratic failure to condemn it. Affirmation number 45. She says once the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, a landmark civil rights and U.S. labor law that outlaws discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, it was less acceptable for white people to admit to racial prejudice. No, the Civil Rights Act was simply a demonstration and manifestation that America was gradually becoming less racist. It was an effect, not a cause. But paradoxically, by trying to outlaw racism, various portions of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 1991 have enabled increasing amounts of anti-white bigotry, as many economists and analysts have shown. So she gets it exactly backwards. Affirmation number 46. She says, an example I often share occurred when I was co-leading a workshop with an African-American man. A white participant said to him, I don't see race. I don't see you as black. My co-trainer's response was, then how will you see racism? This is typical of the way that she misinterprets and misunderstands the statements of whites and Asians. What the person meant was that for the purposes of him interacting with the black person, he didn't see race. So he wouldn't have had a problem going to school, living in the same neighborhood, or playing sports with him, which is the whole point. Race was irrelevant to this person. Affirmation number 47. Racial bias is largely unconscious, and herein lies the deepest challenge, the defensiveness that ensues upon any suggestion of racial bias. No, the whole notion of implicit racial bias has been shown to be bogus, as for example Heather McDonald showed in her book, The Diversity Delusion, which I reviewed on this channel. Affirmation number 48. When talking about moving to Massachusetts, she said, "Other white people warned me not to buy a home in Springfield or Holyoke if I took the position, especially if I had children. While no one openly named race, the racial coding was not lost on me. I now knew where the people of color were concentrated in the area." Maybe they didn't want her to be injured? Like the poor Vietnamese American woman who was withdrawing cash from an ATM and was paralyzed recently by a black mugger, who then was angry when she set up a GoFundMe account which raised over $300,000 to help her deal with the disability he had inflicted on her in his violence? So if whites were to think that because the white community is 5 times less violent than the black community, they're superior in their non-violence presently, would that be racist, Miss DiAngelo? Affirmation number 49. She says, as in other Western nations, white children born in the United States inherit the moral predicament of living in a white supremacist society. The body of research about children and race demonstrates that white children develop a sense of white superiority as early as preschool. No, research doesn't show this. Babies aren't racist. What it does show is the following. Number one, babies like what they're used to. So white babies are used to white parents and black to black parents. And being babies, who frankly aren't that bright, they can get upset if they see people of races they're not used to. In fact, I would bet the following experiment would turn out to be true. If a white baby were to grow up with 2 black parents and in a black community, up until about 3 years old, it would possibly be more comfortable with blacks. If it grew up with whites, it would prefer whites. And if it grew up with mixed parents, it probably would not care either way. Again, all babies do is connect color with what they know and are used to. They're not racist. Affirmation number 50. I am often asked if I think the younger generation is less racist. No, I don't. In some ways, racism's adaptations over time are more sinister than concrete rules such as Jim Crow. Imagine, she'll always see racists when she opens her eyes and looks at whites. Note that she doesn't try to back up her prejudice with surveys, since survey after survey shows younger people to be the least racist of all. So, for example, a Pew Research poll conducted in 2018 found that when answering the question, is increasing racial diversity good for society, 48% of boomers said yes, 52% of Gen X said yes, 61% of millennials said yes, and 62% of Gen Z said yes. Affirmation number 51. She says, the people who cleaned my mother's hospital room, did the laundry, cooked and cleaned in the cafeteria, and maintained the facilities were most likely people of color. They could have just as easily been Irish. Affirmation number 52. She says, George Zimmerman would not have stopped me as I walked through a gated suburban community. Well, that's because you're older, female, and white. If you were younger, male, and black, statistically, you would be much more likely to be dangerous. That's the reality, Robin. Affirmation number 53. She says, once hired, I won't have to deal with my coworkers' resentment that I only got the job Because I am white, I am assumed to be the most qualified. There's an easy solution to that. Stop affirmative action. Stop racial cheating. Affirmation number 54. She says, another way that my life has been shaped by being white is that my race is held up as the norm for humanity. Consider the writers we are all expected to read. The list usually includes Ernest Hemingway, John Steinbeck, Charles Dickens, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Mark Twain, Jane Austen, and William Shakespeare. Again, she has no complaint here. Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, Twain, and I might add Victor Hugo are held up as the best because they are among the best. Definitely better than the mediocrity she offers up to us, Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison, and others. Affirmation number 55. She says, white people will perceive danger simply by the presence of black people. We cannot trust our perceptions when it comes to race and crime. Utterly false. This is what Dr. Thomas Sowell calls discrimination 1B, when we have very little information about a person. So, for example, if we're walking down the road at night and knowing that blacks are 5 times more violent than whites, if we see a black in the distance, it's rational, whether we're white or black, to fear that person more than a white person. Affirmation number 56. She says, many of us can relate to the big family dinner at which Uncle Bob said something racially offensive. Everyone cringes, but no one challenges him because nobody wants to ruin the dinner. And this, she claims, promotes racism. The reality, however, is that the very fact of not laughing at Uncle Bob's remark or joke is usually enough to show him that his remark wasn't welcome. Facial expressions and silence can work wonders, Miss DiAngelo. Affirmation number 57. She says, trying to find more evidence of white racism, consider the extreme resistance to busing and other forms of school integration from white parents. First, of course, white parents ended up opposing busing, which was a disaster, since white parents were supposed to tolerate their children being bused far away into violent and substandard inner-city schools. How many good parents will ever put up with that? Now, if Miss DiAngelo wanted to help black children, she would recognize that public schools, dollar for dollar around the world, are always inferior to private schools, often giving worse results while costing twice as much or more per student. This is exactly what we'd expect of governmental education. James Tooley's magnificent book, The Beautiful Tree, which I reviewed here, shows exactly that in great detail. Affirmation number 58. Relatedly, she says that with regard to busing, school officials, politicians, the courts, and the media gave precedence to the desires of white parents who overwhelmingly and vehemently oppose schools' desegregation. It has not been African Americans who resist integration efforts. It has always been whites. So here she's implying that black parents were for busing. But this is essentially false, as Thomas Sowell said in the New York Times way back almost a half century ago in 1976. Most black people oppose busing. Polls that showed black majority in favor of busing a few years ago had begun to show black pluralities, and finally an absolute majority of blacks against busing. As you can see, Ms. DiAngelo really has an aversion to the truth. What takes priority is her own anti-white ideology. Affirmation number 59. She says, it has been well documented that blacks and Latinos receive harsher sentences than whites do for the same crimes. No, to my knowledge, this is false, and demonstrated at length in William Wilbanks's excellent book, The Myth of a Racist Criminal Justice System. Affirmation number 60. When black and Latinx youth go before a judge, the cause of the crime is more often attributed to something internal to the person. The youth is naturally more prone to crime, is more animalistic, has less capacity for remorse. Well, that's interesting when we look at the possible motivations for Darrell Brooks, the black man from Waukesha, Wisconsin, who drove his SUV through the Christmas Day parade on November 21st, 2021, killing 6 and injuring 62, who were all apparently white. What do you think Brooks complained about on Facebook a year earlier in 2020? White privilege. Brooks was also a revolving door criminal and, contrary to Ms. DiAngelo, treated very leniently by the criminal justice system for his crimes. This is the actual reality of crime in America. A black man kills or injures 68 whites and is not charged with a hate crime. And no whites retaliate against any blacks. But a white police officer kills George Floyd and billions in property damage are occurred and over a dozen people murdered. Does that sound like a white supremacist country to you? Affirmation number 61. She says, parents understand that the predominantly white teaching force has little, if any, authentic knowledge about children of color and has been socialized to see children of color as inferior and even to fear them. Imagine how unsafe white schools, which are precious to white parents, might appear to parents of color. No, the reality is that if we go to charter schools like Harlem Success in New York, black parents love those charter schools and those teachers, whether they're white or black. All those black parents would laugh at Miss DiAngelo's claim that Harlem Success or any other charter school in New York City teaches black children that they're inferior. What pure racism against whites, Miss DiAngelo. Affirmation number 62. She says, someone who tells me that they marched in the 1960s, like the person who tells me that they know people of color, is telling me that they see racism as a simple matter of racial intolerance, which clearly they don't have, or they could not have tolerated marching alongside black people during the civil rights movement. No, they're not saying that they tolerated being next to blacks, but simply that they fought for justice, as they did. See how she twists everything to make whites evil? You can't even be not racist if you risked your life marching for civil rights in Selma. Affirmation number 63. She says, for example, people commonly believe that if a person of color applies for a position, he or she must be hired over a white person, that black people are given preferential treatment in hiring, and that a specific number of people of color must be hired to fill a quota. All these beliefs are patently untrue. Affirmative action is a tool to ensure that qualified minority applicants are given the same employment opportunities as white people. No employer is required to hire an unqualified person of color. Totally false. The reality is that there are many, many cases of businesses being sued by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission or other agencies if the racial or gender balance of their workforce is not in accordance with what it's supposed to be, representative of the country or their region. And affirmative action in schools, as for example, the book Mismatch shows in great detail, enormously damages black students by putting them in classes and colleges for which they are not matched academically, resulting in many becoming bitter and dropping out, or instead changing their majors to something easier. This mismatch effect has been shown time and time and time again. And contrary to what she says, any private colleges can be sued since most accept federal dollars, and private businesses have also been sued by the EEOC. Affirmation number 64. To put it bluntly, I believe that the white collective fundamentally hates blackness for what it reminds us of, that we are capable and guilty of perpetrating immeasurable harm. Given all the statistics which prove the huge racial progress that America has made over the last century, from the dismantling of Jim Crow to the disappearance of lynching to the integration of black Americans into all institutions, you can see how truly bizarre her racist claims are. So in conclusion, let me emphasize one final point that I partly made previously. This is a very privileged person, privileged both by the modern American system of governmentally funded and controlled higher education, which funds her racism, and by the civil rights laws of the United States, which make companies, governmental departments, and colleges so afraid of adverse judgments against them that they hire Miss DiAngelo and other racist consultants like her. In the case of a court trial, they could show that they've done everything possible to reduce a hostile work environment to their black employees. Without these two aspects of privilege, no one would ever have created these racist ideologies, and thus no one would ever have heard of Miss DiAngelo. On that note of privilege, then I'm finally able to retire for the evening, and for a much-needed glass of hot buttered rum, I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.